Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Open Courtauld event this evening. My name is Alex Bovey, and I'm Head of Research and Dean and Deputy Director of the Courtauld, and it's my huge pleasure to welcome you. I am going to explain how this event is going to work in a couple of minutes, but I'm going to start by setting out some of the context for what we're doing this evening. So it's wonderful to see so many of you. We've got hundreds of people in this webinar, and I suspect I don't need to really explain that the inspiration for inviting Professor Dan Hicks to join us this evening is a part of the very necessary, urgent drive for decolonization in the arts, and also for us as a wide community of scholars and concerned people to have a conversation about the restitution of artifacts that have been looted, especially tonight from the African continent. And pressure for us is coming from within and from without to have this conversation in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement and of the anti-racism movement as well. Britain's museums and galleries are custodians of internationally significant objects and artifacts that have untold, misrepresented, or suppressed stories about how they were taken from their places of origin and into the possession of institutions. And often these object histories involve pitiless colonial machinery of exploitation and violence. Tonight's Open Courtauld event allows us to explore an important intervention in this difficult subject by Dan Hicks, who is Professor of Contemporary Archaeology and Curator of World Archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford University. Dan wears two hats, and I think he was wearing them both when he wrote this book. This new book, and I'm just going to hold it up, The Brutish Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, is a deep study of the bronzes and other works of art, many of which are ivory as well as bronze, taken from Nigeria after the British sack of Benin City in 1897. And Dan examines the case of the Benin bronzes and the debate surrounding their return, and through this consideration addresses legacies and debts of British colonialism. And he also offers a pretty unsparing set of reflections on his own disciplines, which are anthropology and archaeology, and of the institutions that he works for, the University of Oxford and also the Oxford's own Pitt Rivers Museum. So these are difficult issues, and we are grateful to Dan for joining us this evening. The huge response to this event attests to the importance of this subject, and we want to acknowledge that this event, like Dan's book, is a part of a larger project in which we're all entailed. And that it isn't just a challenge to the institutions that hold these objects or the disciplines adjacent to art history that Dan represents, it also poses difficult questions for art history. What art history has been in the past, the people, the artists, the questions it's turned away from, and what it might become in the future. So over the next hour or so, Dan is going to deliver a short presentation about his book and its themes. And then my colleague, Open Courtauld producer, Leila Bumbra, and I are gonna ask him some questions and invite you to do the same. So the chat is closed right now. We're going to open it at the end of Dan's presentation. So please hold your questions and type them into the chat when a little bubble appears to invite you to do so. And you're also most welcome to join the conversation about Dan's book and the issues that it raises via social media. Dan is at Prof. Dan Hicks on Twitter. We're at Courtauld Res, and the hashtag the Brutish Museums is where a lot of conversation about this book is taking place. So hello, Dan, and thank you for joining us from your very picturesque book-crammed study in Oxford. Thanks for joining us. Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, I will do. So hopefully you can see that okay, yeah?
Brilliant.
Has that worked, Alex? Wonderful.
Yeah, perfect. Take it away.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. And I guess, the first thing to say is thank you so much for this invitation. And it's overwhelming to see how many people have signed up and are here. I think over 500 are, here, and over 800 actually signed up. So, wonderful to have you here. So I'm going to talk about this book, but also more importantly, talk about what this might mean for anthropology, archaeology, art history, at this moment. The book, really is sort of written from a certain location, a certain position in these conversations over what in the introduction was called the decolonisation. I want to actually think of this as an anti-colonial process in art and museums, actually. But it's absolutely, this is a book which is written from this space, from the University of Oxford's anthropology and world archaeology collections. And it's really a book which, looks at those histories in terms of their ongoing, roles in the present. So it's sort of written as out of my role as an academic at the university, but also a museum curator. I've been here over 13 years now, and a big theme of the book is that, while the work of the curator in many ways is there, to keep objects, the same, to stop, the moths from eating the, fabrics, or the rust, to attack, iron objects. At the same time, some curators have, used that observation to think that their job is to stop, history from happening around their institution, or indeed to prevent, their institution from sort of changing. So this is a book which is a call for change, and a call, really in some ways, to save the idea of something like a world culture museum, a space where we're able to look at art outside of a Eurocentric lens, and we're able to see alternative, ways of living, of seeing, outside of our usual, approach, but absolutely not if that means we have to hang on to, objects which were either violently taken or were taken under empire and under really a duress, where they're being asked for back, and where for many of our visitors, these objects actually represent an ongoing violence, in the present. So the book, in order just to outline for those who don't know as much, as actually all of us ought to, about the Benin objects and the Benin attack, this, iconic example, which is one of just so many other, actually a violent incident, ultra violent, and also actually a corporate colonialist incidents, that happened actually not all that long ago in the later 19th century. Here's an outline of actually, what we're sort of talking about. So we're talking about an attack that happened, that was framed, as a necessary reprisal or a punishment against the Oba, or the king of the city, and what is now Nigeria, where up and down the Niger River, the corporate entity, the Royal Niger Company, and also this sort of informal empire, not a colony but a protectorate, had been, operating really from the early 1880s, in order to advance the rubber trade and the palm oil trade and so on. So that sort of extractive colonialism, the book argues, involved a lot of ongoing, regime changes, violent acts, of which actually, this was only, one example. However, one of the things that happened as a part of this was also the looting of objects. And, I always used to believe, what I was actually told about the Benin Bronzes, that the looting in some ways had some sort of rather grim logic. It was almost sort of necessary because the sale of these objects was there in order to fund a sort of necessary military attack. And Yeah, and actually, as I looked at this over time in the writing of the book, that house of cards about the justifications for this act, and indeed the relationship, importantly, in between that violence and actually objects in an art context in a museum, all of those arguments really fell apart. And so, in fact, rather than being an organized, official government sort of operation, it was chaos. It was a free-for-all. 10,000 objects were taken, really, by the soldiers and the imperial administrators who were involved in this attack. And this was an attack of, Maxim guns, very early, machine guns, alongside rocket launchers, alongside electric, lighting, barbed wire, dum-dums, and so on, against bows and arrows, and against, really, maybe the occasional cannon, which was, hanging around from the sort of 17th century or so. It was absolutely, the sheer loss of life, I think, was again a shock for me. But let's just focus on how art in this moment actually finds itself absolutely at the heart of world history. So we think of these images of these wonderful relief plaques that show the history of court life. This is a sovereign line that reaches back earlier than Elizabeth I, and also an artistic tradition that actually lasted all those years, all those centuries over time. And you have to imagine this attack of the British, was on a sacred mausoleum sort of landscape filled with altars, filled with artworks like this, but also not only, as we imagine at the BM on the left-hand side, the plaques, but also here on the right-hand side, which is the case here at the Pitt Rivers, which is one of the largest collections, about 150 or so objects of that sort of 10,000. You can see that there's a range of other objects involved there as well. And so we might think of the obers' heads, as we see in the middle, that sat on the altars with the carved ivory tusks that told the history of court life, the history of the life events of that ober. Here in these wonderful, as you see in the bottom right-hand side, iconographies of that history, but also a range of other objects made of ivory, famously the hip ornaments, as we see in the bottom left, of the images of the Queen Mother, but also leopards, hornblowers, objects of wood, objects of coral work, and so forth. And so this is what was being taken from. This was an act of attack upon a religious sort of landscape, a desecration, but it was also importantly, also an attack upon sovereignty. So the dispossession of objects of this kind, you can see here in a rare early image, a photograph from 1891, one of the rare occasions, where a European saw, what was inside this abandoned landscape of each of the obers' houses, palaces, which were, left to fall apart, and then each of actually inside of them, these altars, there in order to remember them. This is what the British, burnt and sort of removed. And here the bells at the front and all those objects on top, and the obers' heads are what they then, lined up and sort of sold off. So we imagine, when those of us that know a bit about this history, we actually imagine that this is all about the image on the right-hand side, which is here at the Pitt Rivers, a famous image of the looting as it happens, and the objects sort of laid out in front of these men after, at the site, which they are. But this image on the left-hand side, also from the Pitt Rivers, is not the kind of image that we imagine. The active burning down, as the book sort of goes into, the active demolition and the burning down of the sacred and the royal landscape, even sacred trees, sacred landscapes that then turn into a golf course. within weeks, and a new residency for the British really to take sort of control. So in this context, the taking of these objects has been subject for really a demand for their return for a long time. This is not a new movement. Here is Oba Okenza II after having been reinstated, under the British. Here he is having asked for objects actually to be returned. With that first return, overseen by the British Museum in the late 1930s, the coral work, objects which are essentially crowns and also a garment there. So these royal sacred objects have been asked for a long time, and they have been returned sort of piecemeal. But of course, that work, is only just ongoing. And of the 10,000 objects, as the book outlines, actually, only a handful have actually made their way back. So in order to look at these issues, the book also, for art historians and for archaeologists and anthropologists, it really attempts to look at how our vocabularies, how our theories, how the white infrastructure, of our museums includes intellectual, dimensions, as well as only, the spaces of objects and their display. So I don't have the time actually to go into each of these, but let me just sort of give you a sense of how over the course of the book I attempt to put forward some kind of intellectual resources which might help us move out of what for so long has been a question only of sort of dialogue but not action, in order to dismantle and to reimagine racist organizations. And I think actually, let me talk about the racism first. So, within, actually weeks of these objects being taken, they find their way into regimes of display here in Oxford, London, Berlin, and elsewhere. This is a time at which, anthropology museums, as we, know well when we think about, human skulls, for example, were at that time in the process of being, used, co-opted by a sort of a, proto-fascism, a white supremacy that told the story of, the racist lie of different kinds of human, displayed in skulls. But actually, when we beat the fascists in 1946 here in Oxford, one of the first things that, happened in our museums was that those displays, next door, from here in the Natural History Museum, were all removed, because it was bad science, it was wrong, it was incorrect. However, the displays here in the Pit Rivers that were made actually to tell the same story, but with, cultural objects, with art, here in a museum at the heart of which was an idea of the evolution of culture, the idea that objects evolve and get sort of better. And of course, a museum founded by a soldier who made the argument for the evolution of objects entirely based initially upon, weapons and the victory of those, with a more evolved technology. That means that as these objects were received into the Pit Rivers and other institutions like them, they were weaponized. They were put on display in order to tell the story of the defeat of the Benin, kingdom. And importantly, actually to naturalize and to justify and also to make endure that violence. So here at the Pit Rivers in 2015, when the Rose Must Fall movement arrived in Oxford, there was a key moment where the observation was made, by the campaigners, who were looking at the images of Cecil Rhodes, the images of other ongoing imperial, infrastructures here within the museum, within, our academy. They said absolutely rightly, the Pit Rivers is among the most violent spaces here in Oxford. And at that point, I had never seen it that way. I had worked on empire, on objects in a whole host of different ways, but it hadn't, I hadn't heard it said that way as it was by this African movement, by colleagues, students at that time, who said, actually, this is violence in the present. And it's at that point you realize that actually when the restitution demands are being made, it's absolutely essential that we begin to allow, this infrastructure, this white infrastructure, to be dismantled. So, and this is really, I would say, in some ways, something that in other institutions is really just about tackling institutional racism. I want a museum that doesn't have anything that's nicked in it that people are asking for back. I want an anthropology museum which is in step, we're actually with where anthropology and archaeology are in the 21st century. Not some weird sort of time warp of some racist, nonsense from the 19th century. So some of these ideas attempt to introduce that. So the idea of the necrographic, which is an attack or a critique of the idea of the object life history, of the social life of things. Actually, when an object is sort of taken under these circumstances, we mustn't talk about the life history of an object in an additive, in a positive way, as if it's a new layer of the object's life. This is something being sort of taken away. We need to write histories of loss. We need to face up to histories of death. So I introduced in a piece of work that, or a set of ideas that really, looks at Achille Mbembe's rereading of Foucault, where the biopolitical is sort of re-rendered as the necropolitical, that notion of who gets to live, who gets to die. For us, when we're thinking about objects, again, the biographical needs to be allied, as seen alongside the necrographic. And so later in the book as well, I talk about the knowledge of death and the knowledge of loss as being an important part of how we very carefully, without this ever descending into voyeurism, into dark tourism, as it's occasionally known, actually how we tell those stories in a way, that the museum is able to evolve into something like a site of conscience, into a site, where we're able to remember imperial violence. So at the heart of that, again, is the Euro-pessimism, which is the idea that for as long as these objects actually remain here with this secondary historicity, this extra layer of such loss and such immense violence that reaches out across other expeditions, other objects in this museum, for which demands are really, growing for their return. For as long as they're not returned, actually the primary histories we're going to be able to tell with these things are those histories of violence. And we need to tell those in order to facilitate, their return. So overall, what the book does actually is it says, whatever you call it, the decolonial, the anti-colonial, that work starts with the very, boring, ordinary work of the curator that describes objects and shares that knowledge. So that's the first part of a two-step sort of part of how we work towards returns, because fundamentally this is an action-oriented book about how we advance, the cause of African returns, African restitution. So a part of that is we share knowledge of, we imagine these objects are all in the British Museum. Actually, only 8% of the Benin objects that were taken in 1897 are there. They are across 160 institutions around the world. So actually that work of the cataloguing of where these objects are, is a key element of this. But also, in order just to wrap up, the second part of that is in the sharing of that knowledge is also to amplify and to listen to and to act upon the African, movement, which has been so hand in hand over the years with the fallism movement. Outdoors, the calls for the falling of images of imperialists in the streets, well, the parallel displays created in this very, tight window in between the 1880s and the 1920s, this moment where culture was put to work for white supremacy, that is what we're aiming now, actually to take apart. The work of the curator is central because while the Savoir report observed importantly that 90 or 95% of African cultural heritage is outside of the continent, I would add that from a UK perspective, less than 1% of African objects here in the UK that were taken under empire are on display. So more than 99% is hidden away in the basements, sometimes in boxes which haven't been opened for 100 years. So this, in order just to sum up, is a kind of archaeology. It's a kind of archaeology rather than art history. When some wish to hold on to these objects and to tell the histories of these violent acts, better, more honestly, a lot of that rhetoric comes out. For me, that just keeps that violence going. Our job is to tell the truth and to give things back. When their returns are actually demanded. So for me, time's up. It is absolutely essential that as we do already for skulls and human remains, also for cultural objects, we have on a case-by-case basis, now to be open to the return of objects, that were taken from Africa. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. First of all, I wanted to start by saying congratulations on such a wonderful book. Everyone should definitely read the book. And I'm not even just saying that because you're here, Dan. I genuinely think everyone should know about this period of British violence, especially when I think about my own curriculum at school anyway. We didn't learn anything about British colonial rule at all. And shockingly, until I did my master's, hadn't really considered it as well at university. So I think until, I'm in my 20s now, and it's only recently that I've actually thought about it, and I'm half Indian, so you'd think that something would be discussed at some point. But yeah, it's really important. So thank you again for that. So we're moving on to the second section of tonight, which is a Q&A. And once I've asked you a few questions, I will hand over to Alex, and then we'll open up the chat to audience questions. So to kick off, I'm not alone when I describe your book as a necessary call to action. And I think you alluded to that just now in your presentation. And I think it's almost a sort of manifesto for institutional change, with, I guess, extra urgency when we think about the context we find ourselves in 2020. So what was the watershed moment that made you take it upon yourself to fight for restitution and more widespread education around brutal histories?
Sure. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, as ever, it's odd. People keep saying it's a timely book, and I guess for the Pitt Rivers, which is often understood as a museum of museums, maybe it's more of a sense of a stopped watch that eventually is sort of telling the right time, because we at the Pitt Rivers feel like we've been thinking about these issues for a long time. But of course, the world suddenly, has an interest in these questions. For me, it was the Roads Must Fall movement as it arrived in Oxford, and the wider reckoning. I was when I was a doctoral student in Bristol in the late 90s, early 2000s. I was involved in last time around we were talking about Edward Colston and the legacies of empire. And I mean, my generation, when we were involved in those conversations, failed, to get any of the advances that we've seen, happen over the course of this year. But what stayed with me from those arguments we were having back then was actually the lessons of the Macpherson report. So the Macpherson report into the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence introduced in the UK the notion of institutional racism. And I think in the cultural sector, we haven't started really, to think about that, which here at the Pitt Rivers involves things like, the positive action doctoral studentships that we run for BAME students, which, we introduced 2 years ago, but also importantly, obviously also involve objects of this kind. So it's part of an anti-racist agenda, of course, and it's part of how do we achieve anti-racism in a positive way, understanding, which I'm not sure I did, maybe 15 or 20 years ago. I really didn't understand the links in between anti-racism and understanding the legacies of empire, not as, in the past, but ongoing in the present.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of people that can relate to that. When I think of the moment as well, just now, the use of social and political power to, in some ways, to, decide who lives and dies with COVID. I mean, you see the gaps between minority groups affected. I think it's really interesting when you compare that to the museum sector, in the way that we just seem to completely not even bat an eyelid at some human bodies, like mummies, for example, which is something I actually phoned my mum about this at the weekend to make sure that I wasn't just imagining this, but I just always found it inherently creepy that was something that we just let in, put on display and just walk past. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Well, that's right. And so we here at the Pitt Rivers removed all non-modified examples of human remains from display over the summer. So when we reopened, they weren't on display. And I think that sort of dismantling is really important. I would say though also the Black Lives Matter movement, not only as we've seen it this year, but as it reaches back to Charlottesville and earlier, fundamentally has had an element of it is the politics of visuality. So as the book goes into, Nick Mizof and others have pointed out that what sort of kicked off this movement 5 years ago was actually a visual technology, the dash cam footage and the cell phone footage that suddenly made visible and made shareable anti-Black violence, which had been happening for centuries. And it's simply the seeing, it's the naming of individuals who are the victims of that. So what does that mean for us in museums, where the regimes of what can be seen and what can't be seen, what can be named? For me, the act of listing, that very basic sort of documentation that happens at the end of the book, is an attempt to try to experiment with what might this look like for our sector.
Yeah, definitely. And the counter argument to restitution is generally around the destruction of history. And although I believe representation is essential in the sector, especially when you think about why people of colour are in the UK and the often brutal histories of exploitation. And although that is important, there is ways of doing that is not necessarily in the traditional museum format. And I think something that we've thought about a lot in our team at the Courtauld is that the fact, as a byproduct of lockdown really, and events like this can prove that, is that the sector is completely capable and willing to actually adapt to work in a digital world. So we can access and study objects online from miles away. People will be tuning in right now from all over the world. So I think the argument that we lose history when we give objects back is almost not even, well, it's kind of null and void for younger generations. Because I think what I've found is that they are often more aware of the political weight and legacy of representations, repatriation, and restitution in historic and contemporary struggles for universal justice. So I wondered if you had thought about this yourself, and in an ideal world, what would you plan to do if you did return the bronzes?
Sure, absolutely. So I think, when you give something back, you don't interest yourself, especially if you're the serial killer that took this from the dead bodies, as some sort of sick way of, trying to remember it. You don't interest yourself in what happens, to them after their return. So for me, the unconditional and the permanent return, on a case-by-case basis, right? No one, all these old lies about empty galleries, this is an attack upon museums. So the book goes into how lots of those sort of critiques against restitution, as they emerged around the idea of the universal value of museums around 2002, what I tried to do is to trace the history of those ideas and their relationship with extractivism under empire itself. So there's a reconnection, for example, with the oil industry as it emerges after 9/11. The last time we had a crisis in international tourism, as we're going through now after lockdown, in between 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq. And again, with the invasion of Iraq, I draw all sorts of parallels in between the regime change that happened for the Oba. Back at the other side of the 20th century. But fundamentally, that idea that you've got to get on an aeroplane if you want to see your own, heritage, if you're from West Africa or if you're from anywhere across the global south, that was always shaky, right? But as the visa regimes for Africans have sort of changed ever since 2002, it got increasingly more shaky, and now, if we understand lockdown, which is of course for all of us, suddenly no one could go into museums for a little while, and I think that threw a light on what it's like to see that even the physical proximity might mean that there's not access. And as I say in the book, many of our local community, of the people we say that we serve, feel unable to walk into the museum anyway because of what is here. It certainly means if we see lockdown, if we see this virus as not just a sort of dress rehearsal for environmental change, but the beginning of environmental change. How long is it until maybe now is it that we're not going to see the use of aeroplanes in the same way as we did on a sort of leisure basis? So the relationship of the museum that was instigated in 2002 with sort of destination tourism and with the oil industry, at a point at which in Berlin, right now, the new airport, which has just opened, is hand in hand with the new Humboldt Forum, where they'll be redisplaying, ethnographic objects in a rebuilt colonial palace. This is, Neil McGregor and others continue to work at this intersection. So we need to see it for what it is, understand its history, and also we need to resist it in the present.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to also ask you about another form of criticism which has been brought to the forefront, I think, over the past few months. I'm not actually sure when this happened because it was in 2020 and all my months are just the same month, basically. But yeah, the National Trust shared a thread on Twitter highlighting a series of objects on its sites that have direct and indirect links to slavery and colonization. And the thread highlighted a significant number of people, quite a lot of MPs as well, want our cultural and heritage sites to be completely apolitical. So in light of the backlash and outcry from those members of the National Trust, I was wondering if you and your book have faced pushback from those that believe diversity and inclusion equates to erasure of history or forced diversity or something similar like that. And how do you respond to that?
So absolutely. So the book attempts really to preempt that, and I certainly have had a lot of pushback, of course, but actually not really from the sector, largely from politicians who are attempting to invent a fake culture war, which of course is their first line of defense against the advances made out of the anti-racist campaigns that we've seen this year. So we know that this we have to resist any sense that this evolution of what's happening in our museums, is a part of a culture war. There aren't two sides, to anti-racism. That's not. I mean, I've been involved in anti-racist organisations long enough to know that's the first observation, right? But instead, what the book does is it actually tries to say that the ideology of, actually projection, what I call actually white projection, which is at the heart of saying that the attack is a punishment, that says that the barbarism is actually not the British, it's the victim. That finds its way into the current arguments over restitution. So those of us who say that on a case-by-case basis we should look at this are often described as attacking the museum. My colleague Pelween Saar was described as a militant, which again is using the language as if he's attacking the museum, with in a military way. So those inversions, those constant movings of the positionality was part of the trick of how this was justified in the first place. And so in understanding those histories, we can understand how to push back against against it in the present.
Yeah. So I think that brings me on to my next question, which is actually about an unwillingness from authority figures in national museums, and I guess not even just UK specific, it would be quite a lot like France, I'm sure is quite similar, in Berlin you've mentioned. So I know that loads of people don't want to publish comprehensive accounts, and do you think people are scared of being called out and are just kind of reusing the old tropes of, the fact that they think that bringing these objects brought a broader audience, people can see different cultures, and that we're caring for world cultures by having them housed in our museums and galleries?
Well, I think that's it. So I think, one of the worries from the sector, or from some in the sector, is that we might have to admit the sheer state of so many of these African objects, that are in the region. I mean, most of the African loot in the UK is in the regional museums. It isn't in our national museums. Often these underfunded museums who have been the victims over 12 years of major cuts, don't even have a world culture collection or world culture expertise as a curator. They certainly don't have an Africanist curator. So we haven't invested in simply understanding what's there. Don't ever believe a database. There's so much not on the database, constantly. Here at the Pitt Rivers, we've been incredibly lucky over the years, to be able to invest in the curatorial work. So the database is a reasonable sense of what's there. and it can help us almost as an index to how many other objects there are elsewhere. In Germany, because this is a European-wide movement, in Germany, the campaigns absolutely are centering on transparency, on the publishing of the primary archives. Here in the UK, we should say the same. Why are the archives of our major museums so hard to access? Why are they not in the National Archives? What are we hiding? And in some ways, what we're hiding is simply, not something. It's more complex than the idea that people don't want to tell the imperial histories. It's almost like the curators want to do their job as well as they can. They're underfunded, and they don't want to admit how much of a problem we've got. But I think we have to.
Yeah, definitely. It is really difficult, but I think there's just been a culture for so long of tiptoeing around issues. And I think it's also people don't like to admit when they don't know the answer. And actually, a lot of the times just going, look, I don't know, help me, please, is the best way. So my last question before we go to Alex. So I think you describe in your book actually how we need to slice open the museum to see the cancer inside, which I think is a really interesting way to put it. And I wondered if, as part of the process, if you'd had conversations or were in dialogues with anyone in Nigeria around the restitution of the bronzes. Essentially, what's next?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, I have represented the Pitt Rivers Museum in the Benin dialogue group, which is not a group that has any position on restitution, but really draws each of the key actors from the Nigerian and also the European institutions. Within Nigeria, there's incredible action being sort of taken on this, and so the new museum in Benin City, which is a collaboration in between the three Nigerian-based actors, the national government, the federal government, but arguably, most importantly, the royal court. Each of them are coming together around the new trust, which has been established really to oversee that museum. David Adjaye is the architect. The time is, and also the governor has just been elected for another 4 years. So we have 4 years ahead, I think, of really interesting progress. We have the 125-year anniversary coming up, not next year, but the year after. Fundamentally, the history of these bronzes should not be the history of all this violence. But until we return these objects, that is what they mean here in the Pitt Rivers. So for me, returning them to Nigeria so that there's a whole new source of a museum culture, artistic-led, writers, filmmakers, artists, those working with this history and culture can actually work with their own objects, and can understand the history of Edo people, can understand the history of their belief of sovereignty that was actively, crushed in this instant.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask Alex to appear. Oh, there she is. Hello.
Hi there. Thanks, both of you. I've turned myself back on, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, successfully. That's good. It's been one of those days when I can't take that for granted. Yeah, thanks, both of you. It was a really fascinating presentation and conversation, and we've got lots of questions piling in on the chat. I'm just going to ask one, therefore, to assert a kind of prerogative of the fact that my camera's on. Your book, Dan, begins at a kind of unexpected, and I found inspiring but also kind of emotional place, which was Sven Lindqvist's "Dig Where You Stand." And I want to ask you to say something about that, because I think there's politics in all of this. I mean, even neutrality, of course, is a political position. Like Aristotle points out, it's all political. We can't escape politics. And one of the kind of political questions is about who should do this work, and you make this case, very, very forceful case at the beginning, that you should do this work and that we should do this work together. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that, dig where you stand kind of
you bet.
Cri de coeur.
Absolutely. No, it is a cri de coeur, because here I am, and white infrastructure is one of the overarching notions here. We're incredibly white institutions, and we remember 1884, was the year of the founding of the Pitt Rivers Museum, but also the founding of the new Ashmolean Museum on the site where it exists now. It was also the year of the Berlin Congress, and the year in which the Maxim machine gun, was invented. So here in Oxford, actually disciplinary in terms of our knowledge, in that year of violence, in that year of the carving up of Africa, there was the creation of two different archaeology museums, one for sort of civilization and one for everything else. So the Pitt Rivers, right from the start, that then sort of received the bronzes later on, was not only about the creation of alterity, of the old fake ideas of the primitive and so on. It was about the racialization of its visitors and its curators as white. You come to the Pitt Rivers, you're on the right side of the glass, and thereby you define yourself as somehow more human than the objectified cultures that one sees there. And that, by the time you get to the 1890s, it has this incredibly violent layer. So who are the right people to fight those legacies of white supremacy within our institutions, which of course they are part and parcel of how this institutional racism has led to the fact that we do not, in our diversity, in any way reflect the society and the culture that we say that we serve. Of course, we have to work from within. I, at the moment, am the person with the expert knowledge such that I can tell this story. A lot of this knowledge is really esoteric, and we need to start to share it so that we can empower and we can, the appropriate point, we can pass the mic, to the African claimants way beyond Nigeria, across the continent, who can see their objects in our museums, and if they wish to, are able actually to ask for them back. But yeah, there is a role. Of course, there's a role for white people in the dismantling of, white infrastructure. That I guess is at the heart of this. And disciplinarily, this is not reflexivity. This isn't just, which so often in the 90s served simply to, in a really self-conscious way, recenter the white male, academic. This is an attempt at sort of co-curation. Here in our museums, so often it isn't anymore about the objects, it's about the caring for the people, not the object. And that's why the whole argument here for me is about a seismic shift in how we think about what it is, to be a curator. You can't do it on your own anymore. You have to share the knowledge, and you have to be held to account. This is about the legitimacy of our institutions fundamentally, and making world culture museums fit for the 21st century.
So it's a neat kind of segue. You talk about restitution, and obviously that's one of the driving kind of ambitions of your book, to make it not just to open a conversation about it, but to make some very, very kind of forensic arguments about it. And Jean, surname undisclosed, has asked quite a deceptively simple question. She says, to whom would you want the Benin Bronzes returned?
Sure. So, if you go on the University of Oxford website, we this year adopted a new process for the return of cultural objects, or for handling, requests, because it is crucial that one returns objects, actually to the right people, and that this is responding to demands. Therefore, I mean, what we do there is we talk about how to assess the claims. And how to do that. In the specific case of the Benin Bronzes, there is a local conversation, within Nigeria between the three, major actors: the nation state, the federal government, and the royal court. Really for them to work out the appropriate sort of course of action. It was the royal court itself which was robbed, and the role of the nation state is, to some degree, the history of the nation state is part of the violent history, but of course we also need national governments support for this. So that's a Nigerian question, and I think in some ways some of the objects that were taken in 1897 may find their way into the national museums, and some into the royal court if they're let's say they're sacred objects that are not made to be displayed or to be seen by everyone. But that's not we are responding to demands, not writing them ourselves. What we're doing, what I need to do, is to share the knowledge. So I think in this case, yeah, absolutely, the foundation of the trust for the Legacy Restoration Trust are really handling that, and they're an entirely Nigerian-based organisation.
Thank you. There's quite a few questions actually about the mechanics of restitution, and how it's interesting actually watching the questions accumulate. And speaking of a curatorial challenge, deciding which ones to ask is a bit of an improv challenge.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna turn to someone. I just need to scroll a little bit. Bear with me. To Mary Kate Cleary, who is asking a question, but she also begins with a really nice compliment. She says, "Thank you for your excellent talk and the book, Dan. Could you please speak a bit about the persistent challenges facing museums within current legislation that governs UK national collections in terms of deaccessioning, in order practically to enable repatriation and restitution?"
Sure. Yes, absolutely. So in the new year, we're launching a new project called Devolving Restitution, which is a network of non-national museums here in the UK, because most of the African loot, most of the objects taken under duress from Africa under empire is not in our national institutions. It's in our university museums, our museum trusts, and our local authority museums, even things like regimental museums. Those museums are not subject to the National Heritage Act. So a lot of this talk that people have about the law refers only really to the V&A and the British Museum and organisations like them. Of course, we should remember, in the case of the very different historical circumstances, but the curatorially, analogous sort of situation of claims for the return of objects that were taken as a part of the Holocaust, the law was actually altered for the national institutions for those cases. And importantly, the Washington Principles moved the onus of the responsibility for knowing what was stolen and from whom from the claimants onto the institutions themselves. So we can learn from that, even though it's a very different historical circumstance. We can learn from that, I think, in terms of how we might handle cultural objects. Of course, also remember that the return of human remains is just business as usual for our museums. The national museums and the non-nationals, we're already doing that. And of course, for many African colleagues, that distinction we're making, when an object, a cultural object, may not only represent, but also constitute an ancestor, who are we to decide that a skull is one kind of object and an image made out of brass should be treated differently? They're the questions we're asked. So I think it's really that issue over cultural objects that we're now dealing with.
So on that score, Usman Lawal, who says, "Hello everyone, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Usman Lawal from Nigeria, and I'm currently studying archaeology at the University of Pavia. If I may ask, what transpired between the Kingdom and the British Council? Of all things, why did they choose to loot effigies?" And so I think it's about, what's being looted and whether there's a kind of curatorial practice and why some objects and not others.
So that's absolutely right. So, I mean, that's a really important sort of question. So our workshop series, but also our, African-led work, Action for Restitution to Africa, which is led by colleagues on the continent, in Cairo, in Accra, and in Cape Town. Both of those projects are really going to be looking at the wide variety of kinds of objects taken. So certainly, objects that were taken under this sort of condition, of sort of war and the violent expeditions, often include objects of sovereignty, objects of belief. They're quite specifically in order to try to destroy sovereignty and to destroy belief. We might roll that into missionary collecting, which was taken in all, objects that were taken in order to try to put down, non-Christian ways of seeing the world. You'd be surprised how many Nigerian Islamic objects we have from northern Nigeria here at the Pitt Rivers, which were taken as an attack upon Islam. But also there were objects, archaeological objects, objects of natural history, objects, we have this amazing sort of category of objects here at the Pitt Rivers, of objects that were taken as they ended up owned by administrators because they were used as evidence in sort of court cases, in the criminalization and in some cases execution of Africans. And these things, sometimes weapons, sometimes objects that were said to have been, taken, find their way into the pit rivers when these people retire. How do we understand those histories? There's a whole load of webs and histories of the role of the taking of objects. Of course, I mean, fundamentally at the heart of it is the argument the book also makes about the photographic, that we should, exactly as we should understand a photograph, not as an instant of time, but as a duration. So the taking, not of a photograph, the taking of an object and the putting of it into a museum does the same thing. It serves to make that taking, that loss and that dispossession and that violence, it makes it endure. But importantly, these museums are unfinished events. Fundamentally, something very important to me, theoretically for a long time, has been the notion of the material object as an event. And, these are 10,000 unfinished events. That's how the book ends, that sense. And indeed, even the museum itself is an unfinished gesture. If we get this right, we can think of the curatorial work to intervene with time, to make things last. Maybe it's a kind of hesitation, and maybe there's hope yet that we can turn the Titanic around. We can, whatever we're doing with this institution, there may be something that the Pit Rivers and other institutions actually like it can do, which is positive, which works with all of those legacies of intervening with time, and that really gives back as well as only taking.
So I'm just going to kind of turn back for a second. I want to ask about object biography in a moment, and there's a question from a colleague of mine about that. But before I do, something about restitution. Gayatri Anand has said, what would you, Dan, say to the argument against restitution put forward by people in power about the complications about who to return objects to, i.e. it's too complex, particularly in former colonies where borders, etc., may have shifted as a result of imperialism? And I know from having read your book that you do have quite a lot to say about that.
Yes, I do have a lot to say about that. So fundamentally, this isn't sending back, this is giving back when it's asked for, and it's sharing knowledge so the demands can be made. So as again, I mean, I would refer you to the Oxford University process, which I think is incredibly good, especially because it doesn't take an interest in what happens to the object when it is returned. And there are, if a group of people are so exercised and involved that for decades they will campaign for the return of objects, it's hard then simply automatically to say we're not going to listen to that. It's a case-by-case approach, though. Fundamentally, what I'm calling for, despite what you might read in the Times newspaper, who at one point, although they managed to print an apology for it, said, I just wanted to empty the whole place out. That kind of exaggeration has always been, a part of the pushback. No one is calling for that. What we're calling for is a case-by-case approach where the demands are made, exactly as we already do for human remains, exactly as art museums already do in the case of Holocaust, loot. And I mean, remember, in those arguments in the 80s against Holocaust returns, the same arguments were put. You'll never. How are you going to? Who do you return it to? It's too complicated. You'll be having to delve into family histories. All these things were said, but of course it's a significant and very important part of how we operate as a sector. Yeah. Why should we treat empire when those claims are made in a fundamentally different way in terms of process? I think it's important, it isn't rocket science where it's obviously it doesn't happen overnight either, but the Benin case is so clear cut, it's a good place to start.
So we're coming to the end of our hour.
Sorry, let me just very quickly say, we also need to fight the whataboutism and the where will it endisms. So it's wonderful no one's mentioned the Parthenon marbles this evening, and let's keep it that way, because there is a part of the Universal Museum ideology is to try and constantly flip this from one case to another until we're talking about the Lewis chessman before you know it. Actually, this is not about the idea that one object moves to another as a sort of human universal. In the case of African objects that were taken with violence, it is the racial element, the racist element, of the taking of those objects, of the wider dispossession. We understand this for West Africa in the dispossession of people in the Middle Passage. We understand it with the taking of land. We have overlooked the importance of the taking of objects, the dispossession of art, the cultural dispossession. That is incredibly important as well. For those of us that care about art, we should realize, of course, it matters, you know, and therefore on these things, we need to push back. We need to listen to African demands on their own terms.
Yeah, without the kind of layer of paternalism that so often goes along with it, you know. So Leila, do you want to ask the penultimate question? And then I don't want to make it sound like I'm going to then assign myself the ultimate question, but I guess that's the inference. Yeah. Leila, yeah.
Of course, yeah. So we've had a question from Edwin, who's asking if there should also be a financial repatriation as well.
Sure. I mean, I think the questions over recompense, over actually, I mean, in many ways the reparations campaigns happening from Afro-Caribbean communities, from Caribbean nations, go hand in hand with the restitution arguments. And I certainly in the past, the Royal Court has made the demand that either the artworks are returned or the financial equivalent should be handed over. This is for those who are making the demands, obviously, to make. I would say that those people who say African museums are underfunded, we need to capacity build and train, people first, before these objects go back. That is the paternalism that we were just hearing about. That, of course, I mean, it's almost like we're having this conversation as if the fact that there isn't as much sort of resource in Africa is entirely disconnected from the idea that all this violence and dispossession and theft happened. Of course, this for us in Europe is about a reckoning with our role in the colonial past, and it's about opening dialogues but being open to action. And if financial restitution is being asked for, that's a question for government. But for each individual, your trustee body, I can't underline this enough. For those of you, you're never more than 150 miles away in the UK from a looted African object. You need to talk to your city councillors. You need to talk to your trustee boards across the country, from Belfast to Edinburgh to Derby, to Exeter to Oxford and Cambridge. These are the institutions that can make those sort of returns, and each individual institution can make its own decisions. So yeah, it's about, of course, it's about a wider giving back, and that's why the book, when I talk about moving from a theory of giving to a theory of taking, fundamentally, of course, as we learn from Marcel Mauss, that's all about debt.
And so this book is largely concerned with ethics, and the ethics of collecting and display, and the ethics of encountering provenance and thinking about provenance critically and not defensively. And part of that, one of the things we train art historians to do at the Courtauld is the practice of object biography, tracing an object from its moment of creation to the present through its material changes and changes of ownership. And a colleague of mine, Tom Nixon, has asked about your concept of necrography. He says, when does object biography become object necrography? Do you have thoughts, for example, about the Asante ewers seized in 1896 and taken to the BM, but made in 14th century England?
Sure, yeah, that's absolutely, it's a case-by-case approach in terms of objects as well. The reason to come up with that neologism was really the comments made by Hartwig Fischer, actually in the context of the thing I said we shouldn't talk about, the Parthenon marbles, where he made the point that the taking of artworks is a creative act, right? So he says that you're recontextualizing. And I mean, really what I felt, and maybe the object life history thing is even more powerful in anthropology museums as compared to history of art. It's the absolute dominant trope from Arjuna Padarai's rereading of Capital without, somehow he skipped over the whole bit about primitive accumulation, right? He just had he was obsessed with a Marxian sense of value. And it's like we've ended up, via the legacies of so many people using this idiom, which has become a trope, it's almost like every movement is a positive addition. It's another layer in the life, as if these objects were displaced people seeking who become refugees, who are seeking a better life and get one here in the West. That for these objects and objects like them seem to be completely upside down. And I was reaching out and really couldn't find in the literature the vocabulary to express histories of loss and histories of death. In some ways, it's a kind of archaeology. I'd say it turns history upside down. As an archaeologist, my natural inclination is to begin at the surface and dig down. Whereas historians often, especially when we're talking about object life histories, somehow we're encouraged to imagine ourselves back into some originary moment and then tell the history in the opposite direction. So this is about excavation. In some cases, as the book says, some cases with a toothbrush, and in some cases with a bigger tool, a jackhammer or a pickaxe. That's what the necrographic really demands of us. And for me, it's the telling also, though, of sort of military history. I'm no expert in military history. I ended up knowing a lot more about African wars than I did, and almost that concept of World War Zero, that concept that actually these individual expeditions were actually a long-term campaign for the dispossession of Africa. Again, the necrographic is maybe partly about military history as well. It's all in the it's all in the book, though. That's the
thing, right? Okay. And I think we're gonna end really where your book begins, which is with that call to dig where you stand. And I want to thank you, Dan, for writing the book and for speaking about it so openly, and to my reading, it's quite a courageous book and quite an important one too. And I think it's a important thing for all of us to read. And as a Canadian on both sides of the Atlantic as well, I think there's a lot in this book for people who curate collections that have Indigenous, Canadian, and other. I mean, I think it's a book for all seasons. So thank you so much. I just want to end with two things. Fern has put in the chat a link to the publisher Pluto Books, who are offering a 50% discount on Dan's book until the 9th of December. And I think you get the physical copy and also an ebook as well. There's wonderful photographs in it. And I think that's one of the ways in which the book is quite generous, is it makes a visual argument and an argument about using visual evidence alongside its other arguments. So please do acquire and read Dan's book, and I'm sure be talking about this book for some time to come. Let us know what you think about this event and about ideas you have about other ones where we can follow up in the chat. There are a lot of questions that people are rightly asking about what Nigerian scholars and curators and people make of this book, of the legacy of violence that you describe, and so forth. And I think that's something that we'd really love to do. Moving on from this. And I just also want to end by thanking Layla and my research forum colleagues as ever, but also by calling your attention to one of the ways that we're working to change the courtauld. We have open call right now for 2 new academic posts, permanent posts supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in Black art histories. They're focusing on the period from 1800 to now, and they're very open in their definition. And we're really keen for a strong field, because I think in the end, this is how we're going to change our institution, is by changing the curriculum and growing it and asking new questions about art and the people who make it and the people who buy it, display it, consume it, and so forth. You can find that on our website, jobs.courtauld.ac.uk, and the close date is in January. And also Fern, with amazing dexterity, or perhaps Layla has already put the link in the chat. So please pass on information about those jobs. And look, it's 7:10. We've kept you longer than we said we would. I hope you're not mad, and I hope you'll join us again before long. And to all a good night. Oh God, this is a bit Christmassy, isn't it? To all a good night. Well, anyway, time for a drink. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Alex.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Layla.